Hey there, welcome to episode 74 of the Let's Innovate for Vegas audio program. I am your host, Managing Director of the Innovate for Vegas Foundation, Dan Hugo. We are recording this around 11 a.m. on Tuesday, July 16, 2024. I believe the heat wave is broken, so it is merely hot here in the desert we call Las Vegas. Exciting times. This week, we will pause for open source, the title of today's episode. Talk a little bit about open source today. Actually, a little bit about yesterday. Open source today and maybe the future of open source and why the Innovate for Vegas Foundation and, in fact, most civic volunteer organizations, projects, even individuals in this space are making use of open source, whether it's the tools or the outcomes, the projects on which they are working. Hopefully, wherever you found this audio program, you are able to track down the episode description. In the episode description, we have show notes, including a summary, which I will read to you, and some links. A few links today, relevant and maybe interesting if you are at all curious about open source and how it applies to the world and to civic volunteerism in general. So the summary of today's episode. What is open source and what does it mean to you? Maybe nothing, maybe everything, but it is what powers all of our efforts here at the Innovate for Vegas Foundation, from the tools we use to the things we are building. And there are some things to ponder into the future of all of this. The links for today's episode. First of all, a link to our still not beautified website. I've been talking about this for months now. It's just simply not on the public-facing priority list. I even did an entire episode called Order of Operations. I don't like our website. It was pure utility. It seems stuck in there. And by the way, if you ever hear the term tech debt, technical debt, or project debt, essentially launching a one-page minimal, it does what it needs to do. You know, we have a web presence with all of the details. If anyone is curious, be they from the IRS or from the Secretary of State of the state of Nevada, you know, is this a real company? What are they doing? Etc. So it met that minimal requirement, but then it becomes an anchor that must be lifted off the bottom of the body of water on which we are currently resting. So it is still ugly. It's on the list, but it keeps getting pushed down. It's not critical. I don't think we get much in the way of visits, which makes sense until we actually begin to launch things. And the first thing we're going to launch is Project Act, which I also linked to here. So Project Act, which is a collection of things, tools, methods, to attempt to connect, communicate, and collaborate with other civic volunteers, whether they're individuals or organizations around the country, maybe beyond, to collaborate on open source civic volunteer projects about community elevation and so on. So linking the chain. So check out our website at some point. It will look nicer eventually. It's just not been on the top of the list. It should be. Our GitHub organization, github.com. Oh, so Innovate for Vegas, by the way. Innovate for Vegas, F-O-R. Innovate for Vegas, no spaces or other punctuation, .org. And a reminder, we are a 501c3 public charity. We have been for 2 years. Check out our GitHub organization, as I was mentioning. GitHub.com/Innovate for Vegas. Again, no spaces, F-O-R. So Innovate for Vegas. You can check out our projects, which are in various states of, even after 2 years, just getting started. That's a longer story. And if our pursuit of open source is a problem, which it is not, then part of the problem is something of a disconnect, which we'll touch on here. But I've talked about this before, and we'll probably talk about it again as we start to launch things, deploy them for people to try. And I mentioned Project Act, github.com/project-act, ACT, the Autonomous Cohort Tessellation. So Project Act is where we are trying to coordinate some efforts to build some tools and a process and make use of some older existing sort of tried and true, proven approaches to discovery of other people working on other projects in the civic volunteer space, so that we can cast a wide net, as they say, so we can encourage connection, communication, and collaboration. The population of people participating in civic volunteer projects and organizations has taken an apparent, it's apparent, it may prove to be incorrect. Maybe there's more potential floating around than we are in contact with. So that's one of the challenges, is to connect, communicate, and collaborate with other people working on other projects. So we can ideally, even one person can find projects to contribute to, and that is the seed of tomorrow. So Project Act. Ideally, the people participating in this project, it will not be like a grand, overreaching megalith or anything. Just some simplicity, hopefully will rule, some tools to make that simplicity happen. So the people and it's right now, it's just myself and Nate Bass. Shout out to Nate. Just getting things started, laying down some minimal, a thin layer of process to encourage other people to contribute, so we can make these tools work for everybody. So that's Project Act. So now on to the relevant articles for today's episode. The definition of open source, according to opensource.org. As I will mention, open source can mean different people to different things. There's always sort of if you say nothing but open source, there's usually either, I don't know what that is, I don't know what that means, or there's the assumption that you're speaking of or referring to software, open source software. Open source can apply to different things. There are different licenses that enable certain aspects of open source, like Creative Commons for creative work, the GPL, the Apache, the MIT, the BSD, and the list of licenses that are aimed towards software projects is ridiculously long and varied and confusing. These are the things that define how people can use open source, but also how different open source things can be combined, joining forces, and so on. So the definition of open source, though, is a good place to start. You may hear, and I'm going to refer to this as well, free as in beer, free as in speech. So we'll touch on that. Open source implies free, but it is not required. So we'll get on that. So check out that open source definition. But again, your mileage may vary. I was at an open hardware conference many, many, many years ago, and that was one of the topics of discussion. What does it mean to have open source hardware? And this is a little bit inside baseball, perhaps, but software is usually confined to some source code, some files that describe the code that is the software, the instructions that will be followed, the application that is built, the service that is operated, and so on. Hardware requires parts to be combined and connected, and so on. So not all parts are compatible with an open source license, or open source in general. The creation of the circuit board, which is usually a part of a hardware, and we're talking about technology hardware in this case. The schematic, which describes how to connect everything, and then the board layout, the Gerber, which is the definition of how to actually physically create these connections. Usually it's a silkscreen, masks, and so on to create multiple layers of wire traces and ground planes and all sorts of things. So and then the silkscreen on the top, and even that could face some considerations about being open source. How do you label things? What do you call them? The names and terminology that appear on the board, how much of that should be held back or made completely visible? Usually the latter is the better idea in the long run. So open source hardware, and then you have things like the RISC-V project, which is an open source microprocessor, with an instruction set that's open. The designs are open, but you can look into the details of what it means to be open, because sometimes an open definition design, right? The processor itself is open source, but that doesn't mean the hardware is free. It doesn't mean that the hardware is always completely open source. You have to look at the licensing of how the internals can work. So open source hardware can become a little bit complicated as far as intellectual property and the different steps involved and the different components that are required to build hardware projects. So that's a little bit more complicated, but it's in the same realm. So what does open source mean to you, to me, to other people? Depends on what you're doing. Depends on if you are building something, or if you're just merely using it, or if you're launching a product or service based on it, or it's ultimately worthwhile to learn these things as needed. But you can at least start at opensource.org/OSD, open source definition. Open source needs you. The reason I'm creating this episode on this topic today was I encountered this article on The Register, production by a street. TheRegister.com has an article published yesterday, 15th of July. Open source attracts devs. Let me get the real headline here. Hang on. Why don't I have this other? No. Uh-oh. Did I close that window? No. Okay. That's annoying. I closed the window. Open source is attracting not enough younger people. There it is. Okay, the graying open source community needs fresh blood. So open source has been around for a long time in internet years. It's been around since probably in a form that we would recognize since the 90s, the early 90s. The Linux kernel, which I have a link to the history, was announced on a news group, on a Minix news group, from Linus Torvalds in 1991. Very quickly caught on as an interesting idea. So the graying of open source, the people that are most familiar and that have been building these things for years and have become luminaries and even celebrities in some case. Linus Torvalds, you may have heard that name. Maybe you don't know what he does exactly, but Linus, Linux, he named the operating system after himself. So a lot of people have made a lot of things possible because they've contributed to open source projects. And it's important that the next generation of contributors and people who understand how open source projects work, how the pieces that make these projects up work. It's almost like the COBOL problem, if you remember back in the Y2K days, 24 years ago already, more than that, 25, 26, 27. As Y2K approached, there was this huge concern that all these programs that were running our banking and healthcare and credit and unemployment and who knows what, all sorts of government systems, government services, financial services, all running on computers, big iron, these older systems from IBM and others. They were all running COBOL code, the Common Business-Oriented Language, COBOL, and nobody knows COBOL anymore. So suddenly it was a mad rush to learn COBOL and to go through all of the code and make sure, because of the legacy of expensive computer technology, make sure that the code that was written from the 70s, 80s, 90s, many years prior, that it was not depending on 2 digits for the date. Why is this important? Because today we really have no reality sense. But back in the day, if you could save 2 characters, so, we're seeing 19 all the time. Why are we keeping track of the date with 1986, 1992, 1988, 1973? We can just leave the 19 off. Then we'll save, as you get millions and millions of records, transactions, history files, who did what when, healthcare records, etc., whatever they're storing. If we can save 2 bytes every time we need to do a date, that starts to add up really quickly. You're talking millions, billions. And when disk drive storage and when memory was very expensive, it made a lot of sense to save on that repeated data. Like, oh, everything's a 19, so we don't have to keep track of that. That's just wasting space. Until someone woke up one morning and said, wait a minute. When we compare dates, when we are when we're concerned with date ranges, then we say, oh, from 1968 to 1972. So we enter 68 to 72, and 72 is greater than 68. Well, what happens when the 19 turns into a 20, the year 2000, Y2K? So January 1st, in somewhere along the Prime Meridian, somewhere on the UTC, the Greenwich Mean Time, when the clock strikes midnight, computers will begin to say, oh, 0, even though 2000 is greater than 1999, 0 is less than 99. So that means all of our date ranges, all of our date comparisons, all the expiration dates, calculations involving payment plans, and all manner of things would suddenly break instantaneously overnight. Boom. So there was a huge concern, and because COBOL had fallen so far out of favor, people were just counting on the code working. Oh, it already works. We don't have to even look at it anymore. Let's move on to JavaScript. Or actually, back then it was probably more C++, Java, and MySQL, PHP. So yeah, COBOL. Whoa, what's that? What does that even mean? So people stopped becoming expert or even really familiar with the language, and so luckily the COBOL source code was available, and there are still COBOL compilers. And in fact, there is a GNU. GNU is not Unix. There's an open source COBOL compiler. It's not identical to like an IBM compiler for their older, or even any of their mainframes or large mini computers. So, so you probably want to get the real compiler toolchain and other tools if you're going to be doing it for money. But if you want to learn COBOL, you can make use of open source tools to try your hand at COBOL. And in fact, I think it was during the pandemic when what was it? I think it was in Florida. Their payment scheme for unemployment or for other benefit programs relied heavily on some COBOL code that was not able to handle the numbers because there were so many people, because entire populations during that time were getting benefits and a lot of transactions were being handled. So there was too much. So there was a call put out, oh, we need COBOL programmers to look over this stuff. It's already been 20 years since we thought about this because we didn't learn our lesson. So all this COBOL code, same kind of goes for Fortran as well. There was a call put out a few years ago, whatever that means, 20 years ago, 10 years ago, 2 years ago, that Fortran needs to be faster because Fortran, formula translation, if I recall correctly, Fortran is also old and nobody learns Fortran anymore. Although when I was in college, they were using Fortran to do finite element analysis. So still planting some seeds, but good old Fortran has been replaced by Python, by C++, by Java, Julia, other R if you're doing data analysis, statistical and otherwise, numerical. So all these tools of old have slipped away, but they're still in use. So nobody's really learning about them. So the ability to make use of open source Fortran compilers or RAT4, Rational Fortran, if you can find some RAT4 code you need to modify, if you can make use of open source tools, you can actually turn back the clock. You can go back in time and become expert in these older technologies, and I've heard this said by people, this is one of those learning experiences. Why are we focused on old stuff? We should be looking at new stuff. And I said, and I know this sounds awful, but I said, how do you think all the new stuff functions? Because the old stuff is running right now and the world depends on it, unfortunately. So understanding the past is, I will say, essential. I don't always get agreement from other people. They may think, oh, I worry about the past, but the future is built on the past. So it's important to understand that. And because open source makes so much information, tools, methodology, historical, any open source COBOL code out there is the beginning of, I see how that works. COBOL, Fortran, Lisp has even been around for even longer than those. Lisp has been around for a long time. So learning Lisp or any of its variants could also be useful, and Lisp is still used a lot today in various forms. Scheme, what's the other one? Clojure, etc. So, yeah, learning these old tools, I mean, it's not like a hammer from 50 years ago and a hammer from today are vastly different. So learning how to use tools from the past is applicable to learning how to use tools of the present and the future. So it's something to think about. So open source needs you. People who are jumping in today are really, I mean, let's be honest, they're going to boot camps because nobody needs to go to college anymore. So you go to a boot camp for 12 weeks, you learn some JavaScript and some HTML. I hope that they're teaching accessibility. I don't know that they are. I think most people don't think about that until they're forced to think about it. But you build your website, you learn React, you build components, you complain about why should we test anything? I know what I'm doing, and so on and so on. But when you actually look at how systems work, as Robert Martin says, every time somebody hits a brake pedal, there's a whole bunch of software between that pedal and the brakes in the car. And, we can hope that the person that wrote that code thought to test it so that you are not the one testing it. So the open source history, the open source timeline, and the fact that there's so much experience, so much knowledge, so much history, so much fundamental education from these running projects. These are projects that have been around. They're proven. They work. They're still working. So jumping into the exciting world of open source as a part of a continuous learning objective in the software world or in the technology world, but this can apply to everything. Guess what? Open source recipes for food, possibly published under a Creative Commons license. But what you end up with is, I wonder how people used to use this ancient grain from Egypt, kamut, I think it is. I wonder what people used to create with kamut. Okay, let me check the recipe here. Person with Anubis mask doing the walk like, okay, and then a sun, and I'm doing a little hieroglyphics reference. But the take home is open source means that knowledge is not lost over time. You can refer to things in the past and so on. So the value for younger people to continue to embrace the notions of open source is tremendous, and it's arguably what will power the future. And so it's important to keep that in mind in the present. Everybody's doing it. I have a link to a ZDNet article which came out today, or I saw it today. I think, what was the date on that? I probably don't have that open either. Of course not. Why am I closing these files? I'm so dumb. Don't you know you're doing? There we go. Oh, I didn't close it. It was, I have too many tabs open. So open source attracts, get to the top here. How open source attracts some of the world's top innovators. And that was published on July 12th. So 4 days ago. And open source attracts some very famous people. Were they famous before or after? Could be both. Could be one, could be other. And again, if you are learning, if I want, okay, I don't know Rust. I have not taken the plunge into Rust. I have seen some Go. I haven't really taken the plunge there. I'm old school, so I learned C. Actually, I learned Pascal. Pascal, C, 6502 assembly, some Z80 assembly, some 8086 assembly, some 56002 DSP assembly, some 68HC11 assembly, some 8051 assembly. Assembly language is like the low level programming language of the hardware. The C language, I learned Python because I was working on a project in Python. So I figured, I should learn it. Learned some Perl, not a fan. SQL, I became enamored with PostgreSQL because it does a pretty good job sticking to a standard, which you can actually apply to a Oracle database, which I've encountered now and then. So being familiar with Oracle's SQL, which is the big giant gorilla, but PostgreSQL enables you to play in that space for free. Another open source project. Yay, good stuff. So if I were to say tomorrow or today, I would like to learn Rust, or I would like to learn Go, or I would like to learn Julia, or I would like to learn Pick a language. Zig. The list goes on. There are so many languages, it's not even funny. I used to point people to a project called 99 Bottles, and it would, sorry, a little administrative work there. And it was basically the famous song, 99 Bottles on the Wall. And I can say beer, why not? 99 bottles of beer on the wall. Famous song, take one down, pass it around, 98 bottles. Okay, so that iterates 99 down to 0. So it was short pieces of code written in all languages, computer programming languages, to generate the lyrics of that song from 99 to 0. Thank you, Alexa product. So the idea then is, if I want to learn a new language for programming, if I want to learn something new about a technology and it includes programming, tons and tons and tons of open source examples, places to get started, documentation, reading materials, now YouTube videos and so on. So there's plenty of material and plenty of ways to use that material to learn something new. So to keep my skills fresh. And if you are in the tech arena in any way, things are always changing. So trying to learn something new is better than resting on the same thing every day, right? Arguably, I use Python too much, so I should branch out and try other things. So yeah, I've been toying with Golang or Rust or both. And we'll see how Python code can be converted, similar architecture, different language, and see if we can implement some of our projects in multiple languages if we need to be concerned about things like performance or memory safety or other. So everybody's doing it though. You may find that your skills improve. You develop a project that is very cool. The whole world thinks you're amazing. The history of Linux, which is the next link, is a walk down this path where and in fact, in the Wikipedia page I've linked to here, and you can go from there. As always, I always say the Wikipedia is a great place to start. You don't need to finish your quest for knowledge. So in there is the Usenet post. I think it was from the Minix news group, where Linus says, "Hey, I'm working on this thing. If anybody wants to check it out." You know, Linus Torvalds Linux kernel was basically powering Red Hat, which was purchased by IBM for a few $1 billion. I think it was billions. GitHub is powered by Git, which is something that Linus wrote to deal with, the sprawling population of kernel contributors and the kernel development process and so on. So GitHub was sold for a huge amount of money to Microsoft, and there's something else he was working on. But his use of free software has made a lot of people a lot of money, including himself, from what I understand. I think he's directly affiliated with the Linux Foundation, but he's doing okay. You don't always have to make money by keeping your work a secret. You can make money by letting everybody know about your work and letting them join in and help you. So and there are many famous people. Some of them are nerd famous. It's like being internet famous, but nerdy. But there are some other people and there are some other projects. And if you are familiar with the Android phone, the Android operating system, there's not an Android phone. The Android platform is Linux based, although it's deviated quite a bit. Amazon Web Services are powered by a lot of open source software, including Linux, but including Windows and other such things. And the list goes on. If you are using something with technology, you are almost certainly using some of what you're using is based on, directly or indirectly, open source software, whether it's Linux, whether it's some other tool chain, some open source driver for a Bluetooth component, or who knows. Could be a collection of things. Huge collection of things. So the history of Linux, interesting to check out if you're curious. 1991 kind of took off, and I remember when I was graduating in 1993 from college, one of my colleagues, one of my classmates, one of my friends, he and I worked on several projects together, robots and so on. And he one day said to me, "Oh, there's this guy. He just released he released this kernel project. He's building his own operating system." There you go. We used to read news all the time. Before the internet, there was news. Usenet News was a big thing, so you could find out all kinds of stuff. It was sort of the decentralized network that everybody wants to reinvent, but it was Usenet, I believe, was formed in 1993. The notion of sharing information is why the internet started, the ARPANET and DARPANET. So sharing information as text files that you could move around between different machines, different servers. These things have been done, and this is another example where understanding history, understanding where things come from, understanding what IRC is, Internet Relay Chat. You might look at IRC and then you look at Slack and say, they're not that different after all. So solving problems of today and tomorrow may benefit by looking back. And if things are open source, if there's open source projects, you can look back at the source code or the functionality and say, what can we learn from this? So the value proposition is pretty clear once you get into it. And again, this is mostly about software, but it applies to so many things. Finally, I will end the list of links. We're already, a half hour in. The list of links, I will end on the XKCD dependency. It's become a meme at this point, but that cell, if you're not familiar, is a picture of a stack. It looks like buildings, but it's just a stack of, you could say they're like rectangular rocks. So it's a stack of them, and this big infrastructure, the internet, big business, all these things. And you go down to the bottom, and one half of all this giant pile, which is probably pretty heavy, is being held up by one, you could say it's like a 2x4 or one singular vertical support. And it's the arrow pointing to it is like, this is one guy in Nebraska who nobody knows, and he's been supporting this thanklessly since 2003 or something. So everybody in the open source world knows this, and what that basically says is you and everyone depends a lot on open source projects, components, libraries, but often the people that have written some very important things, creative works, they are not always famous. They are not always even known. They are very often unrecognized, uncompensated, thankless, but the work they do is critical. And I want to say the time zone file is one example of this. There have been a few things through history where you're like, one person is responsible for updating this one thing that is a part of every single thing on the planet, and that one person gets nothing for their efforts. It's pretty crazy, but sometimes people do it because they know that it's important, and it's a task they take ownership of and run with. Probably looks good on their resume eventually, hopefully. So let's get to the show, the actual episode. We will begin with what is open source, which I've kind of touched on in a variety of ways. Open source software may mean different things to different people, though. And as we've said, so if you're a developer, if you are writing software code, even if it's HTML, which is not code, it's markup. If you are building websites, or you might be using React, or you might be using Vue, or Svelte, or what's the Google one? I was going to say Agile, but that's not it. It's React, and the other one starts with an A. I guess it's not as famous as React. What is it? It's it'll come to me. You're learning all these things, so you're hands-on with all of the benefits of open source collaboration and so on. Maybe you check your projects into GitHub. Once again, it's Git was invented by Linus Torvalds, who also invented the Linux kernel. You might be running your project on Amazon Web Services, and so you're using Linux servers or serverless or containers. Containers were developed for Linux and made famous by Docker, but there are different ways to run containers on your Linux system. So all of these things, if you're in this world, then open source means, I can build a lot of things without having to make huge investments in tools. I will say when I was in college and before, so I think early 90s and prior, if you wanted a compiler, if you were building something with a 68HC11 microcontroller or an 8051 microcontroller, maybe you'd have to get the 8051 was the famous Keel compiler, and that was not free. It was like a couple $100, so you could make use of your 8051 microcontroller or its many derivatives. So if you can then say, I'm a one person, I'm a student, I'm a one person startup, I have an idea, I want to try it out. You don't have to spend hundreds or thousands of dollars on your tool so you can make use of open source. And then the idea there is you at some point give back. So maybe some of what you develop can be made open source as well, so other people can benefit where you have benefited. So it makes sense. Open source hardware definitely means different things to different people. As I mentioned at that Open Hardware Summit that I was attending, it was actually in Rome, humble brag. It was right before Maker Faire Rome. So it was the first time I think it was the first time they lined up like that. And so same location, same time, or 1 week before. So open hardware, there were actual discussions, real questions being asked about, well, okay, which parts are actually open source that people can use, which are things that people can see but don't get to use completely for free. Why? Because hardware is hard, because sometimes hardware means using expensive tools and expensive simulation technologies and so on to actually develop viable hardware technologies. So that can be expensive, depending on the business model of the development side. How do I make some of these millions of or more dollars back? And that's where you get into the question of free as in speech compared with free as in beer. Everybody always has to have beer, 99 bottles, free software. So free means different things to different people as well. Freedom of speech means, hey, I can get the source code for this open hardware project. I can build my own processor. Free as in beer, free beer, yay. Free as in soda, if you like. Free as in, oh, I get something, I don't have to pay for it. Now, there used to be this thing called shareware or freeware. So somebody could give away software. They would say, oh, here, you can download this application, or I can, if you send me some money for shipping and a floppy disk, I'll send it to you on a floppy disk. Maybe you could find it on a bulletin board system or download it from a UU encoded multi-part Usenet news posting. So you could download some freeware. So you're basically getting free software, but they might not give you the source code to it. So the free speech, which is I can look at the words, at the code, what makes this thing function, and then there's can I have access to this thing and not pay for it? I get it for free. Or maybe I have to shareware sometimes had you could send them an email or thank you, hey, or because they were like, I'm just curious to know who's using my stuff. There was a movement for a while to send someone a postcard if you were using their free software, free tools. I don't know if it was postcardware, but the general notion was you can either get the source code or you can get the end results for free, or you can get both. And if this sounds confusing or doesn't make sense, think of it this way. When you go to an event, maybe they're offering free snacks. There's a hors d'oeuvres table, or there's a chafing dishes with some victuals of some sort. And you're like, do we have to pay for this? Nope. It's part of the event. It's completely free. Can I get the recipes? Nope. So you may not have to pay for the output, the outcomes, right? So there's a recipe involved. They made the food, the hors d'oeuvres, the snacks, the beverages, etc. You might get them for free, but you don't get to see how they're made. Or you may get to see the recipes, but you have to pay someone to make them, or you have to pay for ingredients. There's a certain cost involved with implementing, even though you have the recipe for free. So it's an interesting world, and for smaller projects, often it doesn't enter into the discussion. You can make use of free tools and build free things and maybe try to charge for them later. And there are different business models. We'll get into ours at the end of this episode. But the ability to have one or both of the free parts, whether it's the source code, the ingredients, the recipe, or the ability to use things for free, even if you don't get the source code or the ability to see the recipe, if you can use the thing for free, that might enable a software startup to form, or a hardware company to form, or a restaurant to make use of free food, or who knows. So having access to these things is an enabler for you could think of it as a long tail, right? Things that take a long time to return on an investment, but ultimately the investment is small. The actual investment, because you You offer these opportunities to tons and tons of people. And then as they make use of your tools or your recipes, your software, your source code, they are able to return something to the ecosystem. Maybe that comes back to you directly or indirectly, but over time, there's a large circle of life, circle of advancement, circle of benefit, and so as long as you're willing to invest in that, eventually things will come back to you sooner. I have this embarrassment of riches before me to develop my project, to turn my idea into something. I don't have to pay hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of dollars for software tools. I can make use of a free year of services on Amazon. There's all kinds of opportunities to make use of open source, free, quote unquote free, to enable ideas. And then later down the road, you could give some of that back, re-inject into the system, keep the wheels turning. There's always the question of licensing. I mentioned Creative Commons. I mentioned GPL, MIT, Apache, BSD. What are the rules? The rules of engagement. If I give you my cookie recipe and I say you're only allowed to use this recipe to make cookies that you sell to people if you also include the recipe for the cookies. And some people might say, well, then I'll sell the cookies and people will get the recipe and make the cookies themselves. You're like, well, that's the way it is. If you want my cookie recipe, you have to share it with everybody who buys your cookies. Or it could be, well, you get to use my cookie recipe, but you don't have to tell anybody anything. You can just say it's your own recipe or any variation of this entire theme. So here's the thing that can get tricky. One of the things about open source is that other people can contribute. They might say, oh, your cookie recipe is awesome, but I added peanut butter chips, and now they're even better. So I've modified the recipe, but it's the same term. So anybody who makes the new peanut butter chip cookies also has to share the source code, the recipe, for anybody who buys the cookies. Well, what if I at some point say, well, now I'm going to change the license on my original recipe so that suppose it was, you can use the recipe for free. And then I say, okay, starting January 1st, you now have to pay me 10 cents per cookie to make use of my recipe. So I'm changing the licensing terms, and we have the latest version of the recipe, which now has organic vanilla as one of the, whatever it is. So moving forward, people using the new version of the recipe might say, oh, I don't want to pay 10 cents a cookie. That's going to take all my profits away. So they'll stick with the old one, the old recipe. And then at some point, somebody might say, well, what about those peanut butter chip cookies? They're using the old recipe, but can they use the new recipe? Well, not based on, because if you saw the recipe for the new cookie with the new ingredient, well, now you can't do that because you'll violate the license. It can get a little bit complicated, and that's just for cookies. So I've talked about this previously, the change of licensing of a few different tools out there, Terraform, Redis. There were a couple of other ones that have made the news lately. But yeah, when the rules change, and it's sometimes a question of, well, we can't make money doing this. But someone might say, yeah, but you took all of our contributions to your project. We've been giving back to the tools that we like to use, and now you're going to take our contributions and change the rules on everyone. So it can get a little troubling. It really comes down to how the business model is developed around these open source tools. And if it ends up being that we have to screw everybody over to stay in business, well, that's a fiduciary question. But from an ethical standpoint, we promised you something. Now we're pulling the rug. We're going to screw everybody over. That is an ethical question that I would rather not have to address myself. So our efforts have a completely different business model, which should not depend on charging people for open source projects, open source recipes, source code, etc. So ours will be a services model, which I'll get to. My own introduction to the exciting world of open source pretty much happened in the second half of 1996 when I was working at Netscape. I mentioned that when I was graduating from college in 1993, I had heard of Linux. Of course, we were using, I've talked about this previously. I think it was Dynix. let's see, it was, we had a sequent symmetry machine. Sequence symmetry. I think it had four 386 processors. Sequent was doing some cool things with multiple processors all connected together and so on. And it was running, where is it? It's not in here. They were acquired by IBM. We did have a Sequent balance, and then it was upgraded to a symmetry. And why are they not having, I think it was Dynix. Yes, Dynix. So Dynix was a multiprocessor variant of Unix. Unix famously changed the world several years before. So yeah, I got my start back in the day on Dynix. We also had a VAX. We had a digital VAX mainframe and some digital minis. So VMS, that operating system, and the VAX processor, hardware setup, and whatnot. Totally interesting parts of history. But the symmetry machine was pretty cool. We had Sun OS workstations running X11. So you could have a graphic user interface with real command line, terminal windows, and all kinds of cool widgets, and the Athena widget set, and all those old school things. So I was already kind of familiar with that part of the world. And then I would eventually, so 93 comes along, about to graduate, just starting to hear about this Linux thing. Like, oh, that's pretty cool. I was still kind of a Mac person, unfortunately. So I had my 2CI, and I was all into, gotta have a Mac. I think the 2CI was the last. No. I purchased, when I was a contractor at Apple, I purchased a Power Mac 7500, which had a really interesting case. So I was still a little bit Mac-ish in the later 90s, in the mid 90s, when I moved to Silicon Valley 93, July of 93. So when I was a contractor at Apple, I think I got somebody to give me their employee discount on a 7500. I think I was in the Newton group at the time. And this is before I would go, it was before I would go to SCM Microsystems, and then I would go to Netscape. So somewhere in the like 95, 96 range, getting over my Mac addiction. So I worked at Netscape. I was working on the Navigator and Communicator products, so Netscape 3, Netscape 4. We were in the security group, so I was working on encryption and all kinds of fun stuff. And we could choose any operating system we wanted to. So I installed for the first time, and I actually contacted my friend Bill, who I mentioned earlier, the one who first told me, there's this operating system on news, you can read about it. So I installed Debian on his recommendation, a Linux distribution that was completely open source. That becomes complicated later when there are proprietary things and the Red Hat world and so on. But Debian, all free, all open. Installed Debian on my main desktop at work. Was developing. It was part of the network. I could use the auto mounter daemon, and I could build our product with GCC, the whole nine. So very convenient. And since Netscape was striving to run everywhere, it totally fit. They were completely supportive of using whatever you wanted to. At the same time, I built my first computer, a dual Pentium Pro machine, on a Tyan motherboard. I want to say I had like 128 megabytes of RAM or something crazy like that. And it was running Debian Linux, go figure. I downloaded Debian packages at work, and I think I had a zip drive at this point, 100 megabyte zip disks. So I would download the packages at work, since we had a much faster connection at Netscape than I had in my apartment, which was connected to the internet with a US Robotics 33.6 modem, blazing fast. So I could keep my machine up to date. I learned all about how that worked. I departed Netscape eventually for a startup called Umax Computer Corp. And my job initially was to work on the PowerPC platform, which was going to support Solaris PowerPC, Windows NT PowerPC, Mac OS, of course, and Linux PowerPC. So because I had touched so many different pieces of computer technology at Netscape, since it wanted to run their browser and server products everywhere. So I have had Tara Hernandez on previously from Netscape from the old days, when her group would build for all of all of the platforms. So, and we touched on it during the show, and it was something like, I'd say at least a dozen officially supported Unix platforms, Solaris, SunOS, IRIX of different versions, AIX, HPUX, probably more. The desktop environment, so Windows NT, Mac OS 68K, Mac OS PowerPC, Windows 95, Windows 98, Linux of various flavors, and then the unofficial support for things like BOS and whatever else. I could go down that rabbit hole all day, but I will say, because I had been working at Netscape, because I was going to be focusing on the PowerPC ecosystem, different OSs and whatnot. One of the first things I did when I joined UMax, I got my UMax S900 PowerPC Mac computer, and I got Linux PPC running on it, which was not too difficult. It only had a command line, so there was no GUI, no X11 running on my S900 at the time. I had a couple of computers, so I was awash in PowerPC hardware at that point. But I was able to use the normal tool chain and whatnot. And then one day we received what's called a drop from Apple, our target OS to launch, because UMax was building Macintosh clones. So the first PowerPC platform goal was to have Mac OS running on the hardware we were building. So open firmware and all. I worked on open firmware too. As a result of this, so I'm down the hall in my cube doing my thing, and I go and I talk to the firmware people, and they're like, "Oh, we got this new drop from Apple, and I can't build it." And they were building it with MPW, the Macintosh Programmers Workshop, which was its own little command line build environment shell thing, and they had a RISC PowerPC compiler in the tool chain, but this was running on a Macintosh, so it was cross-compiling to PowerPC, or if you were running on Power Mac, this was back in the FAT app days, so they had like one application could run on 68K, 68,000, Motorola 68,000, or on a PowerPC part. So I think it was able to run like that. But at Apple, they were building their firmware, they were building their systems on IBM RS6000 machines, so we didn't have those. So whatever they did to this drop, it was not buildable with the MPW tools. Now, RS6000s were probably running AIX, the IBM Unix platform. So AIX has, in its collection of possibilities, the GNU toolchain. So I said, "Oh, let me see if we can build this with GCC and the usual make, GCC, LD, etc." Built like a charm. And so I went back. I said, "Okay," I put the image on the server, and he's like, "Really? You should be in the firmware group." And so suddenly, rather than being sort of I don't know if I was like a liaison or some sort of a whatever my title was, but instead of being an advocate for these different platforms, I was suddenly developing open firmware code in Forth, and I was focusing mostly on the RTAS, the runtime abstraction services, which is sort of like the BIOS interrupt routines in a legacy PC, and getting the OS to boot, and getting hands-on with the hardware since we were designing a new chipset, all this stuff. Very, very, very educational. So having that experience using open source tools and the tool chains and building things was an interesting stepping stone. You do need to have a certain amount of intellectual curiosity. Not everything is going to be obvious and clear sometimes, but if you have the wherewithal to apply what you have learned in the exciting world of open source, where you have so much access to so much information, so many tools, so many examples, it can actually be a little bit kind of fun, actually. So what about open source and civic volunteer projects? The purpose of our foundation is, in fact, the purpose that we have on file, our legal purpose. And I say it all the time. It's to enable and encourage ideation, innovation, and implementation to make our communities better. Purposely vague. We don't have to do software. We don't have to do code, even though we were originally the Code for Vegas Foundation. The things we work on are meant to be transparent and visible, allowing people to participate, to take what we make and extend it, apply it to what they're doing, connect it to what they're doing. Maybe they'll even feed that back to us and we can all benefit. So rising tide lifts all boats. So making our communities better, and part of that is making our work available for people to use, not only use, but also inspect. That is, every once in a while, somebody will come out with something like NFTs, which I think, from what I'm reading now, they are officially dead or worthless. But, NFT is this mysterious technology that I don't understand. Let's use it as the basis for some sort of loyalty programs or whatnot. So there's this mysterious technology. Nobody knows how it works. And, can we see how it works? Well, you have to sign an NDA. You have to pay a fee. No, we're not going to share our intellectual property. Hopefully, if you heard that car go by, you remember I am producing by a street. So by using open source for community elevation projects, if you develop something interesting or novel, anyone, maybe they have the knowledge or wherewithal to have a technical look, or maybe they will trust their friends and neighbors who are maybe working on the project, but it's visible for all to see. There's no back room. There's no secret. It's right here, right? Here's the thing we're building. Here's how it works. Would you like to contribute? Would you like to contribute your time, effort, expertise? It doesn't have to be coding. It could be maybe you speak different languages. Maybe you are one of the primary use cases. Maybe, I always refer to open transit. If you ride the bus, if you make use of open transit, you are somebody that we would like to involve in the development of our project for something called co-creation, right? We don't want to build something and then talk to you later and then you say, this isn't really what we need. So when things are open, when things are visible, when they're transparent, when people can actually participate in different ways, you probably end up with better outcomes that align more closely with what people actually need or want. People can join in, share their contributions with others. Maybe that will help with getting a job, or perhaps just learning new skills. And again, if you're not a coder, there's still plenty to do. Nothing that's actually worth something that will be used by other people is 100% just code and nothing else. There's user interface design, there's documentation, there's testing, there's marketing. Even if you're not selling something, people should know what it is and what it does, and how do I get it? How can I try it? Who do I talk to about when I encounter a problem? So the other important thing is that so if you have people participating, whether they're directly contributing to day, or you have people out in the world who say, hey, I think this is spelled wrong, or, it could be anything. They can contribute in any number of ways. And another interesting thing is if you have a cool project that everybody loves, but maybe the Innovate for Vegas Foundation shuts down sometime in the future, not hinting, that's not foreshadowing. But this has happened so many times through history where somebody loves a game or a piece of software, a tool, maybe a piece of hardware, and then the company goes out of business, or they decide to change. Oh, we're going to pull back. I think, did Samsung do this? But if a company decides they're either going out of business or they're changing their approach to business, they're discontinuing a product, if it just goes away and people have spent money on hardware or they've grown to depend on something, what do you mean it's just going away? So open source projects can live long after the company or the foundation that was, or was behind, making, supporting, continuing development. So if that suddenly changes or comes to an end, the project itself, the source code, the recipe would still be available for the community to take and run with. So that happens. That happens more often than you would think. And as a public charity, we can actually ask for support for the effort of making and deploying community elevation projects, rather than attempting to operate with closed source, isolated intellectual property focused endeavors. So in other words, if you say, hey, would you like to donate to our nonprofit? We are making proprietary software that we're going to sell for money. So what you're basically saying is, do you want to fund our startup, call it a charity, but we're going to go ahead and pay people, or pay our bills, and then you are not a part of the outcome. You have donated, and maybe you get a tax write-off. And I don't know how we would actually get away with that I'm sure there are ways, But if you have open source projects and an open source ethos and you say, hey, here's what we're working on. If you want to join in, great. If you would like to participate financially and enable us to pay our filing fees, our some other services. Hey, we're going to sell t-shirts to fund our hackathon, and we want to have snacks. If you want to donate snacks, or if you want to donate by buying shirts or whatever it is, right? So there are a variety of different ways. When you offer to your adoring public, when you donate to us, here's what you're getting. You're not getting secrets. You're getting utility. You're getting usable outcomes that will last long after we do. So as far as an investment in a community investment, open source makes sense. If you enable people to participate first by having access to the free as in speech, the free recipe, right? You can see how the sausage is made, to mix metaphors even more. And also, hey, you don't pay for it directly, but if you want to support us, we're not a for-profit entity. So none of the money you donate is going to put into the pockets of the people working on things. You're supporting the organization that enabled these. Now we'll get to the value for value model shortly because we're beyond halfway at this point. So hang on. So it opens the doors for collaboration, whether it's collaborating on the creative work itself or financial support or other, and you're not worrying about IP protection, maintaining secrets, preventing people from participating or taking what they learn and going somewhere else. So we don't have to worry about NDAs, non-disclosure agreements, or non-compete clauses or anything like that. Very open, do your thing. And if somebody steals our code, if they don't adhere to the GPL v3 license that we've selected as our default, why did we select that? Because the GPL v3, some people would say it's like a viral license. We don't want people contributing their time for free and then having people capitalize on that after they're gone. So in other words, if somebody contributes to a project and then they move, I got a job, I can't spend time on this anymore, they would realize almost no benefit if someone else took their work and turned it into a commercial project later and they had no say, they were not participating. So the default license approach is to say, hey, if you're going to use our software, you have to at least attribute the work, provide the source code or the links to our code repositories. So it's fair in our minds from that perspective. We may have reason to change to a more permissive license at some point, but our business model is not about that's another discussion for another time. One of these days we'll get a open source attorney on and we can talk about the subtleties, because licensing can turn into a real party. But anyway, the idea with open source in general, from our perspective, is that you're inviting and enabling more people to jump in and participate in different ways. And ideally, they will always, at the very least, there may not be a single dime to be made, but they will always get credit for their work, which is a very important aspect of our project. So open source projects, you can see who, unless they want to opt out, you can see who did what, who contributed to it. Hey, we're looking for a developer in our team that works on exactly the sort of thing you did here. Can I contact that person? Well, you don't have to ask. There they are. You can hire them to work on on your project. There's no non-compete. There's no NDA. We're not going to stand in the way of any of that. In fact, part of our value proposition is that person getting paid for their expertise at some point. So, perfect. So the future, as we mentioned in the Register article, just like the global demographic, the population of open source people contributing to projects directly or indirectly, is aging. So it's very important that younger people, the junior level, whether it's code or creative people in general, they have to be involved. They have to understand the notion. They have to see the value. It cannot be, well, what's in it for me? You can very easily fall into that trap if you don't understand the long tail, or if you don't understand, for example, that the thing that you are using right now, the thing that you depend on for whatever it is you're working on, see that JavaScript web app you're building, thanks to going to boot camp and learning how to build JavaScript apps for a browser, or maybe you're building in React Native, so you're going to run it on your Android or iPhone, those are open source tools. You're benefiting. You don't have to pay for those. So what if you had to pay, $500 a month licensing fees or per user, etc.? So without connecting that value proposition, you can run into the COBOL problem. Like, I don't even know what open source is. I depend on it, but I don't know what it is. The famous XKCD, you click on that link, it goes directly to that particular, what has become a meme. It's important to understand where open source fits into the world and how people fit into that world as well. There's so much to learn from others and from pursuing projects out in the open where feedback and collaboration are not only possible, but perhaps encouraged when your cool idea turns out to be useful to a lot of people. The beginnings are the best time, where somebody stumbles upon something like the Linux kernel and says, hey, this is great. Well, what if we do this other thing? And what if we add another thing to that? And this many years later, you have the world being powered by Linux. If you have some new hardware, and this has already happened like 100% of the time, RISC-V RISC-V launched, and it was like, okay, RISC-V has been available as a instruction set for 10 minutes. Does somebody have Linux running in an emulated RISC-V on a normal computer? Like, oh yeah, we had that running half a second after the instruction set was finalized. So it's completely possible to advance technologies and implementations of things around new technologies by having access to so many tools that are open, modifiable, adaptable, etc. So the value proposition is difficult to argue with. And you can learn along the way if you take part in. If you said, hey, I'm going to learn how FPGAs work. I'm going to implement a hybrid 68HC11 8051 so I can run different code on the same part depending on the ISA, the instruction set architecture of my target. So you don't have to emulate one or the other. You can actually run both, and maybe they can pass information between each other and so on. So multiple ISAs on a single part, single runtime could be an interesting experiment. Guess what? You have everything you need to do that already. So turning ideas into functional things that people can try and build on from there could be infinitely valuable. And once you do something interesting, other people want to join in. And this is where everybody learns, and the entire notion gets elevated, and rinse, repeat. And let us not forget, once again, not everything is code. Open source notions can be applied to all aspects of any endeavor. I used the food example, the restaurant, the food outlet, the event. They may give away food. They don't necessarily give away the recipe, or vice versa. You can apply open source principles to anything from medical technology to the gene sequencing to food technologies like seeds. Not everyone has to be Monsanto, right? So yeah, sharing ideas ultimately comes back. There is a return on the investment. It's just not always clear exactly where. A better understanding encouraged in the early years in anyone who is interested in contributing to any sort of project notion, even if it is proprietary, closed source, and so on, is a part of general awareness about how the modern world works. A lot of the modern world works because of the open source notions, and these are found also in mathematics and science and in a variety of technologies. Guess what? There's a reason that even global superpowers who are not exactly on the same page politically, geopolitically, yet they still join up in the orbit of the Earth, the Soyuz Apollo connector, right? How come science can make that connection? Because ideas and sharing them is ultimately beneficial regardless. So understanding how that works, becoming a part of open source efforts, whether it's software or otherwise, is ultimately a good investment. And that's part of the reason we're pursuing what we're doing. Something that may not be easily apparent in our closed system world and the parts of it that are still intellectual property driven. Think about now, not everything is always what it seems. So when you think about Facebook giving away their Llama large language model, yeah, it's open source. Read the fine print. But because certain things are open source, people are able to learn, continue development, go in different directions. And now there's a ton of open source machine learning and so-called AI that people can develop for free or extremely cheaply, low cost, which allows them to take their ideas and run with them. So again, ultimately, the long tail investment does come back either directly or indirectly. It kind of elevates the entire ecosystem. If you are inclined to open the system, look inside, and fiddle around with some of the pieces, you will benefit, and so will everyone else eventually. So we're coming to the end. I'm going to comment on something I've commented on many times in the past, our value for value notion. It's not a model that's in practice just yet, but it's essentially how volunteer time can be tangibly valued. Now, when you volunteer your time for anything, some of your personal reward, some of your personal reasoning, why am I doing this? Why am I showing up to participate in this activity or spending my time on developing something, or why am I doing anything? Some of that reward, some of the reason has to come from inside, has to come from you. So we assume that takes place, that you can find that. Developing a business model around open source can be tricky, and we've seen some cases where terms had to change, where companies are like, oh, we can't afford to do this without changing our terms, our engagement with our community, pulling the rug in some cases, making people feel bad. I'm not laughing at that. It's one of those things that you're like shaking your head laughing. Probably something that many people would be familiar with is the Oculus acquisition by Facebook. So Oculus was a Kickstarter project. So people supported the endeavor early on. So they put money towards the first release of a version 1 product. So they've put in their money, they get their product, eventually they ship it. So they've been, legally they are not investors, right? So they're not entitled to the spoils. But when Facebook acquired Oculus, people did pretty well. And then all those people that enabled them to reach the point where Facebook wanted to acquire them are like, well, so we put our money into this thing and then we're kind of left hanging. And that can be no joy. This, same thing can happen with open source projects. If you look at something like Terraform or HashiCorp, HashiCorp is being acquired if they go through the antitrust investigations and so on. Acquired by IBM, which also acquired Red Hat. And that has made people unhappy over the years, the way that Red Hat's business practices and interaction with their communities, even with Fedora, their open source product. Things change. Things change when big companies acquire small companies. Hey, we're going to give everything away for free and profit on volume is not always agreeable to the bigger fish. So when these things happen, there can be bad feelings. So when HashiCorp changed their licensing, so you couldn't build products on their products for free. So if you were a small consultancy and you're like, hey, you can take Terraform and our wrapper and you can, TerraGrunt, things like this. Suddenly you're not allowed to do that. So then there's a fork, and then there's Open Tofu, and there's bad feelings about HashiCorp, and now they're being acquired. So these are the sorts of things that can leave a bad taste in people's mouth. There's inequities. Hey, I put my time into your product, and now you're taking my time in your product. You're changing the rules so I can no longer use your product the way I was using it, because I did put time into it to make it better, and then I built something on top of that. So you're changing the rules, and now I'm going to have to pay, or you're going to get rich off of, there's all kinds of inequities. So for our foundation, we are all volunteers. I've already said the joke, but it's, Dan, how can you do all this for free? And I say, well, the answer is simple: volume. That's a Saturday Night Live Change Bank reference, if you're curious. The Change Bank SNL commercial, look it up. So we're all volunteers. Everybody contributing their time, effort, and expertise to our projects is in it for this similar outcomes. Hopefully you're doing it because you enjoy doing it, or you're building something that will solve real problems, but you're not being told what to do by like a paid manager or member of the foundation or a for-profit entity of some sort. There are some notions, there are some business models. Code for America was keen on having a municipal partner. So the municipal partner, maybe it's a city agency, a county, state, federal agency or other partner that says, here's what we need. Maybe they would fund some of the effort. Who knows? Whatever the business dealings were. And so Code for America had paid employees, project managers, and so on, coordinating the efforts of volunteers who are not compensated, possibly delivering outcomes to these partners. And then in at least one case that I experienced directly, because I did ask, hey, where are the volunteer names? Who contributed this product? The announcement included the people that are paid employees, but the volunteers, suddenly we didn't have a list of that. Well, we can get back to you on that. So I think that's kind of unacceptable. So part of the model for participation in civic volunteer products and projects and outcomes should at least be attribution. You should at least get credit for your work. And ideally that will lead to somebody saying, hey, I want to hire you, or hey, can we hire the whole team? Or hey, how can I give back in a value for value model? You have given me a ton of value. You've solved my problem, whatever it was. You've closed the gap. You've made my use of our transit system better, easier. You fixed some things that were never going to get fixed otherwise, etc. So how can I return the favor and give value back for the value I received? The value for value model, it's been in use everywhere. So nothing new there either. And the possibility of a financial or other recognition becomes a part of the equation where I'm happy to have built something. I've learned a lot collaborating with others. And, oh, look at this, I got a job. Or I have items in my portfolio of experience to put on my resume, on my curriculum vitae, that will help me down the road. Not only what I've learned directly, but the experience that I can apply to the next projects, and maybe I'll get paid for those. Or, hey, look at that. We have a donation button on our platform that we've powered by the volunteers of Innovate for Vegas Foundation. And people want to donate money directly to the teams. This is money from people to you because you are getting full credit for your contribution to the project. This is not you hiding. You can opt out, of course. This is part of the model, is you're not forced to do anything. But you are receiving direct recognition from your adoring fans because they realize that the time and effort and expertise that you contributed has value to them, and they want to return the favor. This is also not a new model. So financial and other recognition for project contributions is built into how we advance our causes. So if we deploy products, so projects turn into actual things, like they have a name and production by a street. So product is not quite the same because there's not like a profit motive per se. Although our projects could also be deployed as products of for-profit entities, still powered by Innovate for Vegas Foundation volunteers, and they would still get name, credit, and all that. But the for-profit entity could actually sell a product or services around the product. Look at WordPress. That's a fairly substantial example. I think something like 70% or something of the internet is powered by WordPress, which is frightening. So the ability to turn the efforts of civic volunteers into a return on that investment for those civic volunteers is baked into our entire model. And that is how open source projects can work if they're kept small. Now, if your foundation or if your nonprofit entity or your civic volunteer cohort ends up having to hire on people to manage things, if you're hiring people who are not directly in the path of open source, community elevating projects and contributions of creative works and so on, if it becomes I got to get paid for my time, then you'll start to see the erosion of this long tail model where, and again, as I say all the time, I don't want to see people working for free. I don't want you to work for free, but I want you to be willing to work for free. So as people join a product development effort, a project development group or company or foundation, If there's an expectation that they're exchanging their time for money and they're not investing in the long tail, then suddenly now we got to make money to maintain our foundation, and then it becomes tricky to give stuff away and so on. So hopefully we don't get to that point. That would be a completely different discussion if we ever even head down that road, if we ever head down that road. So for the time being, collaboration with other civic volunteers with a similar mindset, the notion that you can contribute your time, effort, expertise to open source efforts, whether they're software, whether they're hardware, even whether they're the components that make a viable product or platform or service, language translation, testing, documentation, user interface design, user experience design. Not every coder understands how other people use computers and technology. So sometimes having somebody who actually knows what they're doing, who's willing to contribute to a project, will be worth more than the code. The perception of a thing is sometimes at least as valuable, sometimes more so than the thing itself. So hopefully, as we grow, as we begin to deploy things, there will be people who draw motivation from within and who care about delivering something cool, about solving real problems, about getting feedback, about co-creation, and maybe they'll enjoy getting some attention for from their larger communities for their efforts, such that they want to support not only the efforts in general, but the individual contributors, the people in the communities, and the individual contributors can see that, oh, look, I contributed some time, effort, and expertise for free, and I'm getting a return on my investment far beyond what I thought I would. That's the plan. So open source, if you are using open source, and you almost certainly are, keep in mind that the people who make what you're working on go are not always paid. There are companies who pay their employees to work on open source. They have a model that is conducive to that. A company like Intel, for example, and I know this for a fact, having worked there, people who work on open source, as paid employees of Intel, are helping open source software to run better, faster, more reliably, more securely, etc., with different levels of success on Intel hardware. So in the Intel business model, the long tail for them is pay people to make open source better for Intel products. Therefore, when people buy Intel products to run open source software on, they will have a better experience. They'll want to buy more Intel products. So that business model is different, but equally valid. There are several ways to go. So I will leave it there. Don't forget, we are a 501c3 public charity. We're a Nevada nonprofit. If you would like to support our efforts, now we don't have much to show at this moment. So this is not a handout just yet. Luckily, our bills are very low. We just had to pay our annual list filing fee for the state of Nevada. It was $50. So our bills are in the 2-digit range. Our total costs for the year are in the 3-digit range. Our total donations for the fiscal year ended June 30th are, unfortunately, this year in the 2-digit range. But we want to show, don't tell, we want to show deployed things. We want to deploy projects. We want to have people see what's going on, what the value proposition is. Oh, I see what you guys are doing. This is very useful. Can I give you $1? Well, yes, of course, but the processing fees at Stripe will take away most of that. We'll probably get 80 cents or so. Is it 80? It's 25, 75. Is it 20 cents? 80? I think it was 67 cents maybe. I can't remember. We did get a bunch of dollar donations for some reason. I think it's 67 cents. And we even do have a reduced rate as a charity for processing. But the take home, when we have value to share with people, hopefully we will receive value in return, whether it's on an individual contributor basis or for our organization. The world at large will realize the value proposition and will react in kind, whether hiring people, throwing a couple bucks our way, throwing a couple more bucks our way, etc. So interesting times ahead as we enter our 3rd year. And I just wanted to underscore the importance of open source, and it was appropriate that a couple of articles have just come out in the last several days, whether yesterday or 4 days ago. And this is an ongoing thing. This has been something that people talk about, think about, comment on, worry about for a very long time, years, decades. What happens when people forget about open source until, like COBOL, they suddenly realize that nobody's been maintaining this stuff? Now what? Luckily, it's high profile enough with these huge acquisitions and the embarrassment of riches when it comes to tools and platforms and YouTubers creating how-to videos and highly opinionated videos and so on. So hopefully there will be a little bit of a spark occurring more frequently to lead people, not only coders, everybody thinks that it's just code and nothing else, but people who want to contribute their time, effort, and expertise. And I try to underscore that not everything is just time. It's not that you're sitting down and just spending a couple of hours. It's actual effort. So not only is it time, there's an opportunity cost, but there's actual effort. You're actually doing something. And sometimes you're bringing expertise to the table that people don't always completely appreciate. So it's the contribution of these things from people who see the value over the long term that is what makes the world what it is, for better or worse. And that is where I will leave today's episode. I thank you for listening. Thank you for being supportive of the Innovate for Vegas Foundation. Hopefully more so as we have some work to show for our efforts. Project ACT will be the first primary focus, even though My Muni and Welcome should be, and even though our website should look more beautiful, it has fallen to the bottom of the to-do list, even though it's at the top of my own to-do list. So one of these days we'll sort all this out, and we should have a primary point of publication for our content by now. And that's part of this whole priority inversion thing. I don't want to say it's a problem, but it's one of those things. And that is where I'll leave it. Again, thank you for listening. Don't forget, check out our website. It will look nicer someday. And there's at least a link to our GitHub organization, innovateforvegas.org. Check the links of this episode. Thank you.